What if the greatest empire you ever built was held together by a string no one could see, thin as fishing line, invisible against the sun, but drawn so tight across your life that one wrong step could cut you to the bone? He used to dream that the line hummed at night, a faint vibration above the bed, a wire pulled between past and future, like a note that never stopped. The noise was his first alarm clock and his last lullaby. He learned to live with the hum, then to love it, then to fear it. Because the hum meant momentum. And momentum, he discovered, is a polite word for a storm you have chosen to run in front of. He started with a magazine because he needed a voice before he had a map. He was young and thin and perpetually unsure, with ideas that arrived faster than money could follow. He printed pages in rooms that smelled like glue and ink and borrowed time, slipped bundles of hope onto trains that did not wait. He couldn't quite hear letters in the order the world wanted. Words curled away from him like fish, but he heard rhythms, and he learned to fly across meaning like a stone across water. The magazine became a club for those who felt like the world had been built without them. He would later say that the secret was never a secret. He made a door where there wasn't one and stood beside it telling people they were allowed to walk through, from pages to records, from ink to vinyl, from the speechless urgency of youth to the smooth groove of a needle accepting you as you are. He rented a church and filled it with sound. He signed artists that frightened the careful and electrified the bored. He made covers that looked like daredevils at the lip of a roof. And in those years, when the nights were longer than money, he discovered that bravado is a raft you assemble while already at sea. He'd look out over his studio cables like vines, microphones like black flowers, and make a promise to himself. No one would drown on his watch. He kept saying yes to more. A record label needed wings, so he built them. A brand needed a family, so he gave it a surname. Version and audacity, a joke, a vow. The logo cut the air like lipstick on a letter. He put it on everything he could coax into motion. Cassettes, storefronts, posters, planes. Especially planes. The sky had stared at him for years with an expression he eventually translated as, "Why not?" So he called around. He called and called until a plane appeared, not because the world agreed, but because he refused to accept its refusal. He put a bed on an aircraft. He put a bar in a cloud. He stood in front of crews and said with a half smile, "Let's make them feel like they've been missing us their whole lives." There is, in every ascent, a hinge so small it looks like luck. For him, it came as a decision made at a desk where the sun could not reach. He had built music into a city you could live inside, and then the airline began to burn through oxygen faster than the record label could breathe. Numbers are loud when they are drowning. He watched a column of debt rise like a tide against a wall where the faces of artists had once smiled back at him. And he did the thing he was most afraid to do. He sold the city to save the sky. The day the contract closed felt like cutting off a hand to keep the heart beating. He walked out into the light with a check and a ghost, both heavier than they looked. He told his team a story about the future and told himself a different story about loss. The plane took him home that night, and he looked down at a silver wing and realized he had traded a past he loved for a future he did not yet know how to forgive. Success refills. He learned this. He watched it pour back into the rooms he had emptied with that sale. The airline became a kind of flagship for the idea that a brand could be not just a logo, but a tone of voice, a way of speaking about the world. He opened gyms with music, so loud you could hear your own courage between tracks. He sold cans of cola that threatened the throne of a red empire and bent only when the shelves did not move. He invested in trains that felt like a handshake after years of hard travel. He announced a spaceship the way you announce a promise, by making it sound like a memory that just hasn't happened yet. He flew balloons until the map looked like a story. He was a man who put his name on risk the way others put their name on stationery. But the hinge has a twin, the hairline crack. You can have both and not notice until the floor whispers. It began with the softest betrayals of scale contracts that said one thing in daylight and another in the late-night fax machine. Partners who loved the dream but needed the accounting. Deals that depended on weather, on fuel, on the way a single angry headline could ripple through the economic bloodstream. He hated meetings that began with the phrase, "in principle." He hated anything that sounded like a gate designed to open only for the person who built it. He discovered, in the mirror of the international terminal, that charm is a type of currency that fluctuates hourly. He also discovered that secrets in business are rarely cinematic. They are spreadsheets with quiet teeth. He learned how often goodwill was a trust you could spend only once, how often a smile in a photograph was covering a bruise from the negotiation before it. He learned about clauses with soft voices and hard endings. He signed his name on documents that protected him from bad faith and discovered they protected almost nothing else. He promised staff he would hold the line and then watch the line move. He lay awake and listened for the hum, and sometimes heard only the rigid silence of numbers that would not be moved by hope. Yet the public face glowed. Cameras love a man who laughs at gravity. He turned his birthday into a business meeting with the sky. He climbed masts as if the world were fixed by the act of balancing. When storms came, and they always do, he was photographed leaning into them. He had trained himself to speak in futures. Investors wanted to hear about tomorrow's river more than today's drought, and so he painted rivers until he could taste water on his tongue. Some nights he'd go home hoarse from optimism and sit on the floor to find the ground again. The empire spread so far that even he began to get lost inside it. There were licenses and franchises, and ventures that only shared a last name and a sense of daring. He started to feel like a father whose children had grown into different surnames without telling him. The phone rang with opportunities and alarms in equal measure. A food venture loved the brand until the brand did not help. A bank venture loved the name until the numbers didn't. A media play adored the aura, but not the cost. Meanwhile, the airline the jewel lived on margins that couldn't remember what generosity looked like. Oil prices turned the future into a coin toss. Strikes sharpened the air. Competitors learned to copy hospitality as if kindness were a feature. The lawsuits came like weather fronts you could only observe. Then there were the accidents time refuses to smooth. A test that went wrong in a desert where the horizon is a straight line someone drew with a ruler. A name that had promised heaven attached to a loss that could not be accounted for by press release. He stood on stages and tried to fit the English language around the shape of grief, tried to explain risk without sounding like a gambler, tried to say, "We will continue," without stepping on the grave of someone who could not. He loved the sky, yes, but that day he understood that the sky does not love you back. It is merely a place that tolerates your presence until it doesn't. And still he kept going, because that is what he had taught everyone to expect. The balloon finds the wind. The ship finds the seam of light on the water. The plane finds the smooth air above the turbulence. He learned to be the man who finds. But in the evenings, he became the man who counted. He counted creditors who were also friends. He counted the months left in the runway. He counted the ways a brand can protect and the ways it cannot. He counted stories as assets. To those stories he told about daring and delight, and wondered how many more he could withdraw before the account was empty. He told himself a truth he did not share, that every miracle he'd ever delivered had a debt attached, and the debt was collected in private. He remembered the beginning then, the ink on his fingers, the way a page can be the whole world if you stare at it long enough. He found the old hunger strangely polite now, standing at the kitchen door as if asking whether it was welcome in a house so far from the first flat. Hunger nodded at him. "You built castles," it said, but you used me for the mortar." He laughed, tired and sincere, and said aloud to no one, "Of course I did." The hum returned, faint and insistent, like a horizon that won't leave you alone. And in that humming came the first confession he didn't know how to make on television. The secret was not a scandal from a single night, not a betrayal in a single boardroom, not a signature on a document that twisted in the wind. The secret was simpler and heavier. He had taught the world to read his risks as a romance, and sometimes that story kept him from telling the truth, even to himself. The truth was, he had been bruised by the very optimism that fed him. The truth was that he had gambled with his own name so often that he could hardly remember the original bet. He poured a drink he didn't finish and watched the sky through a window thick as a secret. Tomorrow there would be a camera, and a question he had been asked all his life. What's next? He used to love that question. He used to believe it was a bouquet arriving at his desk. Now it felt like a bill. He closed his eyes and remembered the church-turned studio, and the first time a song filled the rafters with a belief that belonged to more than one person. He wanted that simplicity. He wanted to ask the sky for its first kindness again. But you cannot return to the start without paying the toll for all the miles between. He stood up, and the night felt like a ledger. He was not a man designed for silence, but silence had been following him like a second shadow. It sat beside him on flights when the cabin lights dimmed and passengers closed their eyes. It waited outside conference rooms where strategies grew like snowdrifts. No one could shovel fast enough. It even followed him onto stages, hovering just beyond the applause, asking a single, unglamorous question. Will this work? In the early years, that question had felt like a dare. Now it felt like an invoice. The empire had multiplied into constellations. He could point to dozens of ventures that glowed when the night map of his life was lit. Gyms built like neon cathedrals of sweat. Hotels that promised joy instead of beige. Telecom the color of strawberry candy. Trains that wrote their own timetables in apology to the past. And the airline, always the airline, shaping itself to new storms as if the sky were teaching it fresh alphabets. He believed in the crosswind idea, that the uplift from one wing could keep the other in the air. But crosswinds can also push you toward the mountains. He had learned to smile through lost quarters, to declare that the year was an overture, to insist that the next chapter carried a sentence friendlier to profit. There is a kind of courage you develop when your debt matures in public, the courage to stand on your own brand and say your own name until it sounds like a plan. He practiced this courage so long it began to feel like a habit rather than bravery. Late at night, he would catch himself rehearsing sentences for interviews, polishing them until they could pass for truth, then setting them aside to whisper the other truth to the ceiling. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. He knew some things, though. He knew that people, real human beings with mortgages and songs for their children, had built their livelihoods around the red script of his signature, and that when he spoke, he was not only defending his risk, but theirs. So he kept his promises louder than his fears. He flew inaugural routes as if the future had already agreed. He sat with engineers whose sentences began with if and learned to place his hope precisely, like a weight over a blueprint, so it wouldn't curl. He hugged cabin crew who cried after cutbacks and told them that clouds break, and some days he believed himself. But the cracks kept filing their reports. Things went sideways in ways only insiders can write in shorthand. A funding line that suddenly spoke a different language. A regulator who asked for paperwork that had never existed in any previous universe. A partnership that shrunk under the hot light of quarterly truth. A currency wobble that turned yesterday's math into a rumor. He watched his team absorb the blows with the grace of professionals who have learned the art of deflection. Today will hurt. Tomorrow will justify. When tomorrow didn't, a certain quietness moved into the hallways. There was a flight he will never forget. not because of the route or the view, but because the return had been delayed a dozen times by circumstances with the polite name operational. Passengers, some of whom had chosen his airline out of loyalty to a story they lived inside their heads, sat slumped in departure chairs, eyes dull with the particular exhaustion of uncertainty. When he finally boarded to speak to them, a kindly ritual that could not fix, but might soothe, he looked down the aisle and saw his brand reflected everywhere, and none of the reflections looked like joy. At 30,000 feet, he had promised a bar in the sky. At 0 feet, he was delivering the arithmetic of weather and crew hours. He understood in a new way that a brand can be a promise too big to keep every day. The descent did not arrive as a crash. It arrived as a series of negotiations with gravity. A balloon that once chased headlines around the world landed more often in hangars with the lights off. The spaceship's timeline turned into a string of dates that sounded like apologies, even when they were achievements. The airline swore it would be fine until it wasn't. He learned how a global event can turn money into mist. He learned that lenders, however warm their greetings in earlier years, will test the temperature of your blood when the wind shifts. He sold assets that had been meant for the grandchildren of ideas. He shook hands with partners who smiled for the camera and counted to 3, and then began to count something else entirely. And because the world loves a reversal more than a romance, the headlines sharpened. They did not accuse. They inquired in a tone that did the work of accusation. They asked about solvency with the rhetorical tenderness of a surgeon holding a scalpel. They asked whether the empire was a mirror trick that looked infinite until you walked behind it. They asked whether the man who had made himself a synonym for daring had finally been outdared by the math of time. He answered with the dignity of someone who knows performance is not the same as pretense. He spoke about restructuring like a builder talking about rain. He made room in his sentences for the workers before he made room for himself. He tried not to say the name of loss too often, as if it were a superstition that would notice itself if invoked. There were days when the phones went quiet, and that was worse than the reporters. He had spent a lifetime chasing noise, the good kind, the kind that signals that you are alive to the world. Silence feels like an indictment when you have been a parade for decades. He walked the island trails with the sky pretending not to stare. He remembered that magazine, the first act, the way a stapler can sound like a drum if you are 20, and the world is elastic. He asked himself whether he had allowed his reflection to become his religion. He suspected the answer and didn't like the taste of it. He had always been a collector of moments. The first time a passenger lifted a glass at a bar where there should have been only oxygen. The first time an artist heard their own voice coming back from a million strangers. The first time a balloon pulled free of its own gout. He reached for a new kind of moment, now small acts of repair that did not care for cameras. He wrote letters by hand to staff who could not sleep. He called suppliers and asked how their children were doing and meant it. He told executives to stop using words that turn worries into furniture. He asked younger leaders to disagree with him in front of him, to make a practice of the discomfort that had often only visited the room after he left it. He learned, very late, that a founder's face can become a filter that distorts the view from the ground. When people look up and see you, they squint. Squinting is not seeing. He stepped back where he could, and then discovered that stepping back too can be more performance than transformation. He didn't know what real humility felt like until he encountered bills that his charm could not renegotiate. He didn't know what surrender felt like until he saw his signature beside the legal equivalent of mercy. The consequences were not cinematic. They were human. A crew member found new work in a uniform the mirror did not recognize. A supplier scaled down the Christmas they had planned. A family moved closer to grandparents because commutes were no longer anchored by the red script of a brand. He absorbed these as if they were weather reports, and then realized they were names. There is a cost to ambition that accountants cannot itemize. He started to carry that cost like a talisman that didn't bless so much as her mind. And there were betrayals, the mild kind that business teaches, the slow distance that grows between people who once plotted miracles together and now plot survival separately. He discovered how loyalty can be sincere at noon and unavailable at 4. He learned that some friendships need profit to breathe. He did not blame, at least not aloud. He simply noticed the pattern and filed it beside 100 others under the heading. No one told me this part when we were writing slogans. One day, in a hangar that smelled like metal and daylight, he walked the length of an aircraft that had carried so many of his promises between weather systems. He placed his hand on the hull and felt warmth that did not come from affection. He whispered something he might once have said to a band before a show. Let's give them everything. Only now the them was the creditors, the regulators, the future, the people whose lives had braided into the brands. He realized his everything had become something different, less spectacle, more answer, less dazzle, more repair. He decided then that the rest of his life would be a conversation with consequence. He would keep building where building made sense, but he would stop pretending that risk, by virtue of being thrilling, was also virtuous. He would stop telling the story that every fall is a prelude to flight. Sometimes a fall is a fall, and it hurts exactly the amount it should. He would keep creating rooms where people felt seen, but he would not call those rooms invincible. He would admit, finally, that the greatest empire he had built was not a company, but an appetite, and that appetites need rules if they are not to eat you back. He made peace with some things that had no reason to forgive him. He sat with families from days he could not change and did not offer a speech to fill the gaps. He sold assets without theatrics. He closed chapters without confetti. He kept one island and turned it into a school of mornings, a place where the hum returned but softer. He learned to listen to a horizon without immediately negotiating with it. He reminded himself, sometimes aloud, that achievement is not a personality, and that adventure, noble as it can be, is not the same as being good. And yet, because he could not entirely rewrite his bones, he continued to look up. He found a smaller hunger on the far side of loss, the hunger to be useful without being adored. He invested in people whose eyes held the version of belief he remembered from his first studio. He sat in the back row of lodges and clapped like a father who had finally learned the art of leaving a room. He gave advice only when asked, and then only half as much as he wanted. He learned that the best use of his name, after all these years, might be to make space for names that were not his. In quiet moments, he returned to the secret, the line that hung above the bed. He saw it for what it had always been, not a trap, but a thread, one that stitched his life together from opposite directions. He could have cut it. He didn't, so he learned to hold it in his hands like a string pulled tight between boy and man, between first risk and last apology. He pulled until it sounded a note he could finally live with. It was not the thunder of applause or the rush of assent. It was a thinner sound, a human one. If you are waiting for absolution, he would tell you gently, you have misunderstood the terms. The world is not a courtroom, and none of us are trying a perfect case. The world is a ledger and a lullaby, and you must learn to read both in the same light. He lost things he loved. He kept things he did not deserve. He grew old in a house that once echoed with the language of launch, and he grew kind in ways that ambition had not asked of him. He thought about the staff he could not save and the promises he could not keep, and the thing that will forever be both his sin and his sacrament. He believed too beautifully in what might be. So he sits at a window and watches a sky he once tried to own. It has forgiven him nothing and granted him everything. His reflection shifts in the glass when clouds pass. Somewhere a plane he named is landing. Somewhere a company with his script over the door is closing for the night. Somewhere a young person reads an article about him, and hears the hum of a string, they will pretend they cannot hear until it is the soundtrack to everything. He smiles at that and feels the old hunger approach, like an old friend who has learned to knock. There is pain in this ending and consequence, and the sound of a curtain that is not falling so much as settling into a new shape. He would like to tell you that he has found the secret to the line, but lines are meant for walking, not solving. Instead, he will offer this. There is a difference between being fearless and being honest. One got him here. The other will get him home. And in a life spent renaming gravity, he is finally learning the quietest word in his vocabulary, a word that feels like landing gear meeting earth. Enough.